very much for coming. It's a great pleasure. Today I want to talk about semantic relations between perception and belief and cognitive penetration. In particular, I want to start with a quick introduction, and in this introduction I'm going to argue that we need semantic relations between perceptual experiences and the conceptual content of belief on the one hand, kind of for our epistemological purposes, namely to justify perceptual beliefs on the basis of perceptual experiences, but also, and more importantly for this conference, to define and understand what cognitive penetration is supposed to be. Good. And for this purpose, I'm giving this quick introduction. Then I'm telling you what the content of perception and the content of beliefs, the conceptual content of beliefs is. Then I'm in the third section, I'm going to argue how we indeed can argue and justify beliefs on the basis of perceptual experiences. And then in the fourth part, I'm going to argue how we should use the semantic relationships and justificatory relations between perception and belief to understand cognitive penetration. Good. So let's start with the epistemological problem of perception in the sense of justifying beliefs. There was a mistake on this. So when we talk about perceptual justification, there kind of think of the following two examples. When Arthur perceives a red rose, then Arthur becomes confident and thus believes that there's a red rose in front of him. This one we typically would consider as a justified belief on the basis of perception. Now consider Ben. Ben also perceives a red rose, but then Ben becomes confident and thus believes that only communism can lead to a free and just society. So whatever the merits of this belief are, it's certainly not justified in virtue of the perceptual experience that Ben has, right? So, and that's our intuition here. Arthur is justified, Ben is not, at least on the basis of perception. But why? And of course, the standard answer that we want to provide is this kind of we come up with the traditional picture of perceptual justification. So this means at the beginning, this is the perceptual experience. This somehow justifies and causes a perceptual belief, and then later on we can use this perceptual belief to justify further hypotheses about the world. And then, according to the traditional empiricist picture, the idea is we can fully rely on our perceptual beliefs. Of course, the perceptual belief has conceptual content, right? So there are concepts that are the main building blocks of these perceptual beliefs. These perceptual beliefs, in turn, are justified on the basis of our perceptual experiences. And somehow the content of perceptual experiences is independent of all our beliefs, desires, and of our concepts and conceptual schemas. That's the traditional picture of perceptual experience. So traditional in the sense of when you start with logical empiricism or even British empiricism. But of course, in the contemporary epistemology, there have been some objection against this traditional picture. So one is this one. If the content of perceptual experience is non-conceptual, then there are no semantic, no logical, and therefore also no justificatory relations between perceptual experiences and perceptual beliefs. Right? So this has been argued basically by Davidson. And as a reaction, many epistemologists now hold that the content of perceptual experience is conceptual too. Right? So we just say, on top of this picture-like part of perceptual experience, there are also the propositions in there, and somehow we can use them to justify our perceptual beliefs. Right. So an argument to this effect would be going along the following lines. Right. All content of perceptual experience is potentially relevant for justifying beliefs. That's just what it means to be content. Right. So that's kind of basically an analytic truth. Second, if the content of perceptual experience is potentially relevant for justifying beliefs, then that content must be conceptual content, because if not, there are no logical relationships between perceptual experiences, between the content of perceptual experience and the content of perceptual beliefs. So I'm going to argue that this is the false premise, and then we can conclude all content of perceptual experience is conceptual, because that's what content is. Right, so this accumulates in the same content thesis that's, for example, discussed by Susanna. All content of perceptual experience could potentially be also the content of belief. Good. But then we have a second problem. Suppose this is true, right? So perceptual experience comes with content, and this content is conceptual as well. Nowadays, basically, everyone admits that the conceptual content of perceptual experience, if there is such a thing, is can be influenced by our concepts, by our theories, right? So for this we have a lot of arguments, not just from the history of science, but nowadays also from empirical psychology. Just the categories that we are using, they are not independent of our previous beliefs. Right, so it seems like the only thing that we can use to justify perceptual beliefs, namely the conceptual content of our perceptual experience, is not sufficiently independent to be used to justify perceptual beliefs. So this is I feel like like a dilemma. We are now at least as an internalist concerning justification, we're hitting a dead end here if we follow this language. Good. Now to cognitive penetration. Right, so there's one important question, namely how do we want to understand cognitive penetration? I'm not going to argue here in this talk that cognitive penetration takes place, that we have empirical evidence or something like this. I'm a philosopher. That doesn't work in that way, more the a priori kind of philosopher. For me, it's just about the definition of cognitive penetration. However, I need to use certain alleged examples of cognitive penetration just to tell you what I'm trying to do here. Right. So, a first case of cognitive penetration, alleged case of cognitive penetration, that I want to discuss in this paper is this one. Right. So, the misperception of brightness of faces due to the agent's beliefs. According to Levin and Banerjee, white faces were consistently judged to be relatively lighter than black faces, even for racially ambiguous faces that were disambiguated by labels. Accordingly, the relatively abstract expectations about the relative reflectance of objects can affect their perceived lightness. Right, so here we want to understand why is this supposed to be a case of cognitive penetration, right? So, what are the properties that make this empirical phenomenon a case of cognitive penetration? Another case, so the first case is considered to be very problematic, is this one, right? So, I'm one of the most recent papers in this field is from Witzel, 2016, the misperception of the color due to the agent's object knowledge, right? So, Witzel in his paper calls it a memory effect instead of cognitive penetration, but it's this study has often been cited as these series of studies have often been cited as cases of cognitive penetration. So Witzel writes, a seminal series of studies showed that memory modulates color appearance. They showed that observers see images of fruits as colored in their typical use when their physical color actually corresponds to the neural gray of the background. Since then, this method has been successfully employed to provide further evidence for memory color effects. So the idea, obviously one doesn't see this very well, there have been two kinds of study in this area, but very roughly the idea is that people tend to see the gray of the banana slightly move towards the yellow spectrum. So in one study they were asked to fix the gray of the banana to the background gray, and then they always went a little bit into the bluish, right? So in order to counterbalance, so to say, the yellow they see in the gray banana. And in the second one, from Witzel 2016, what he actually does is he just uses two shades of gray, namely one with the standard gray and one which is slightly blue. And then he basically asks which one corresponds more to the background gray, right? So he does this with gray disc versus gray banana. So, but also bluish disc versus bluish banana, etc. And again, here you find this effect. You find kind of, and with this he argues, in my view, successfully against some of the objections from Firestone and Scholl against these kind of interpreting this as a case of cognitive penetration. But again, for the details of this talk, it doesn't matter. However, again, we would like to ask, why is this supposed to be cognitive penetration? Right, so, and here they're kind of concerning definitions of cognitive penetration. There are two kinds of approaches, right, the neurobiological approach and the more philosophical approach, right? So the neurobiological approach kind of basically argues that cognitive penetration is a specific kind of causal influence on a circumscribed and possibly unconscious portion of visual processing, right? So just what takes place in the brain, in neurobiological processes, it doesn't appeal to consciousness. A more philosophical approach, right? So when it's about justification, then it's the question whether cognitive penetration is better understood as a specific kind of causal or computational influence on the consciously perceived perceptual experience. Right, so it's on the output that is consciously accessible to us, the output of visual processing. Yeah, as already said, as an empirically uninformed philosopher, basically empirically uninformed, I'm taking the philosophical approach. I cannot say anything on the neurobiological approach. Good. Then a first possible definition that people come up with is this from Stokes here. A perceptual experience, E, is cognitively penetrated if and only if E is causally dependent upon some cognitive state C. And the causal link between E and C is internal or mental. There are many problems here, many open questions. So what are the external variables that we should have fixed here? Sensory stimulus, state of the sensory organs, attention, perhaps environment and cultural background, perhaps in part, I don't know. More importantly, however, as McPherson argues, just internal, that's somehow not enough, right? So McPherson writes, I believe that today is the day of an important so she provides this example, and it reads like this. I believe that today is the day of an important axiom. This belief causes stress and brings on a migraine. The migraine causes disturbances to my vision, and I now experience flashing lights at the periphery of my visual field, in addition to experiencing the scene in front of me. And she says, there is no cognitive penetration in this case, even so, according to her, this is internal and mental causation, right? So even migraines have to do with neurotransmitter release, etc. And so we shouldn't be kind of too restrictive on kind of what happens there in a migraine case. And then she writes, there is no cognitive penetration because there's no intelligible connection between the content of the belief and the content of my visual experience. Right, so, and then we're back at Polition, right? So Polition wrote, an influence that originates outside of the visual system and affects the content of visual perception, what is seen, in a certain meaning-dependent way. That's what we call cognitive penetration. If a system is cognitively penetrable, then the function it computes is sensitive in a semantically coherent way to an organism's goals and beliefs. That is, it can be altered in a way that bears some logical, semantical, justificatory relation to what the person knows or believes. Right? So the same problem that we hit before now also comes up in the case of cognitive penetration. Right? So remember our first problem, if the content of perceptual experience is non-conceptual, then there are no semantic, logical, or justificatory relations between perceptual experiences and beliefs. And so if there is some non-conceptual content of perceptual experience, then this cannot be cognitively penetrated because there is no logical and semantic relationship between perception and belief. So they cannot stand in the right kind of relation. Or, alternatively, you mean just the conceptual content, but then we're basically cognitive penetration just means theory lateness. There's no difference there, right? So because we already admitted that the conceptual content of perceptual experience is can be influenced by cognition. So it seems that if we want to go further here, for both problems, for the problems of justifying beliefs as well as for kind of understanding cognitive penetration, we somehow have to find like semantic, logical, justificatory relations between perceptual experience that are non-conceptual and the conceptual content of beliefs. And that's what I'm going to aim for in this talk. So first I want to introduce these relations. Then I want to show how you can use these relations to justify perceptual beliefs on the basis of perceptual experiences, and also to provide a more adequate account of cognitive penetration. Good. Yeah. I start with the non-conceptual content of perceptual experiences. Most cognitive scientists believe in the non-conceptual content of perceptual experience anyway. Right, so you see this also in most of the talks here. People just talk like there's some content, like how the lines are tilted, etc. The way we talk is very often kind of that there is some content in perceptual experience, even for these low-level kinds of content, and very even non-conceptual. The arguments for this come from our discriminatory abilities, that they are more fine-grained than our ability to draw conceptual distinctions. So we can distinguish two shades of color without kind of being able to introduce a conceptual distinction between them, right? So that's an old argument from Evans. Then the accuracy conditions seem to be different, whereas kind of for conceptual content, it's more or less very often a yes or no affair, right? So they're true or false, ignoring borderline cases, but for perception it's quite different, right? So how far away from me I see you, that's a more or less accurate perception, and not kind of a yes or no affair. Then also the behavior of certain non-conceptual animal and pre-conceptual infants has been argued as an argument for non-conceptual content. So if you believe that animals show very, very smart behavior, if you do believe that they run on an engine that's not already conceptual content, right? So the high-level conceptual content that we are running on, then you have to say a little bit more kind of what's the information that their behavior is based on. And the idea is that this non-conceptual information. And then, of course, also the ability of children to learn new perceptual concepts, right? So the children, the idea is we shouldn't assume that they are born with concepts, with all the concepts that we are having, and they just learn the labels for this, but they acquire these concepts somehow. And again, this has to run on some information engine, the non-conceptual content. But of course, the problem here is this is non-conceptual content so far is just a negative kind of content that's not conceptual. But we have to say a little bit more kind of how we should model this. Color perception. That's my main example that I'm discussing here, right? So if you take a look at the psychological literature here, the idea is our color perception can be modeled in a three-dimensional space. We have three dimensions, namely hue, brightness, chromaticness. And every shade of color that you can perceive can be modeled as a point in that space. Right, so obviously the first one that's very unrealistic kind of comes just from our mathematical desires for clear and nicely cut spaces. This one is a more realistic one. So that's how we perceive color. I believe that's from the late 90s, the most recent color space that still works in three-dimensional space. So nowadays color perception is represented as points in a five-dimensional space, but for obvious reasons I cannot demonstrate this on this slide here. But nevertheless, the idea is every quality dimension in here represents one respect in which we distinguish between colors and shades. Every specific point in that color space represents a very specific shape of color that you can perceive. And very important here, difference in that space represents similarities. Right? So this is an important issue. Good. And in principle, you can find arguments for this that this also works for shapes, right? So in Ma's book on computer vision, right? So the idea is we can even represent like shapes of a person in a high dimensional space, right? So you have the number of cylinders there, the angles in which they stand to each other, the length and the width of each of these cylinders. And with this, you have already you can represent very well how we perceive. And he even shows how you can kind of come from a picture-like input, how you can construct a point in this high-dimensional space representing the content of your perceptual experience. So in principle, this is generalizable and has been used also in computer science, etc. So this is 80s. That in principle, one can use this, and kind of like in linguistics, right? So for us philosophers, propositions only have the kind of P. And here I'm also ignoring the kind of how many dimensions the space has, how to measure distance here. I'm just assuming a point in the space can represent the content of your perception. Good. Conceptual content. And here I'm relying on Gerdenforth's idea, but you find most recent idea of conceptual content, but you find this idea already in the early 20s in Carnap's work. Right, so in der logische Aufbau of the world, so the idea is that certain concepts, specifically perceptual concepts, the idea is correspond to regions in our phenomenal similarity space. Right, so, and that's an assumption I'm following, right? So Gerdenforth has special requirements on this. He thinks kind of natural concepts are only those that satisfy this convexity requirement here on the left. But in principle, I'm not assuming something specific here, right? So you could also go for the star-shaped concepts where you have a prototype and everything that shows in the middle of the star and everything that shows certain similarities to this prototype kind of is also in the concepts. I'm fine with this. And this is also one of the nice features of this approach, that it's easily combinable with certain empirical findings that we have of prototype theory in psychology, right? So the concepts are closely linked with the prototype. Good. And from this idea, we also get a good idea of how conceptual learning, right? So if infants could work on this engine of non-conceptual content, right? So for kids, it mostly works like this, right? So they see an object, for example, this specific dog, and mom utters a completely new label, fat. Right? So, and that's the content of the evidence the child perceives. And what the child then has to do, so to say, is from an inferential perspective, come up with a good hypothesis what the word fat means, given its different, given the different evidence it perceives. So, and then, of course, right. So, from a single positive example, there are a lot of inferences to some extent the child can do. Right? Might mean Labrador, might mean dog, might mean mammal, might mean animal. So there are a lot of options that the child can infer from this. And to answer the question how they should infer, right, so in rational constructivism in psychology, people assume, at least kind of as a heuristic, often assume that it should be understood as an induction task in Bayesian reasoning, right? The child, so to say, gets certain evidence, and it accepts that hypothesis about the kind of what the label fab means, that is most plausible in light of her evidence. In the following, I assume that this is the right approach. Here, I need this later on for modeling certain cases from how we go from concepts to beliefs. But one can see already how this in principle works, right? So from this non-conceptual content, you just hear you have a label, and you have a point in the space that corresponds to this label. Now the question is, the child has to infer a hypothesis, so to say, about the region that corresponds to this label. That's how concept learning works, right? So they're starting with this non-conceptual content, with this phenomenal similarity space, and so to say, delimiting regions in that space, that's concept learning. And you also can explain, by the way, how you get these probabilities just from the geometric features, but I'm leaving this out away. Good. Now the question is, how can we now use this theory to reason from perception to belief? So how can we justify beliefs with the recourse of perceptual experiences? Right, so justification, standardly in epistemology, is considered to be probabilistic. So people then introduce the probability framework here, and they typically do this for an algebra of propositions. But of course, this leads us to a problem here, right? So the propositions are kind of are supposed to be this conceptual content that come from your concepts and predicate logic, basically. And that's not really helpful here. So the standard theory seems to be unable to integrate perceptual experiences here. However, in cognitive science, we use random variables anyway, right? So random variables are you have these continuous random variables that can take on a specific value, right? So a variable x that can take on a specific value. And we can define probabilities for them as well. So kind of here it's not a binary variable that takes on the value true or false, but it's a variable that can take on many values. And by combining this with the conceptual spaces approach that I introduced before, we can provide an answer here, right? So the idea is the color perception is a random variable. Kind of you see the color of an object. It takes on a specific value. And we can define probabilities for this. So suppose, for example, this is kind of just in the two-dimensional case, suppose here from S to T that corresponds to the region red. What's the probability of that some object falls into this region? And then kind of we just take this the definition of probabilities over random variables, which roughly just takes this geometric approach here, right? So you measure the how large the area below this probability densities are to get the probabilities for this. So we have a, so to say, a very nice geometric approach to explain how you get the probability of something falling into the region of red from these probabilities of random variables. And so we can very nicely explain this now, how we infer beliefs about the color of an object from our experience of color. So let me take you through this now step by step, right? So in our visual experience, the color is represented as point in the color space. The visual representation of the color is therefore analog or continuous, right? So it has this, in contrast to being digital or discrete. So this means roughly that the correctness conditions, the content of your perceptual experience is more or less accurate, right? So and it's not a yes or no affair. And therefore it's also not in that sense conceptual, because as already said, the conceptual content says it's in that region or it's not. It's a yes or no affair. This is the second part, right? So in cognition, or in our kind of perceptual beliefs, right? So if we have a belief, this object is blue, then the conceptual content, this object is blue, corresponds to a region in that space, right? So a region in that space corresponds to the concept of blue. And an object is in there, or it's not in there. So it's a yes or no affair. This is following the idea of Gerdenfors here. And then in the third step, we can also directly infer a belief about the color from the from the content of perception, in particular, right? So we have this point in the space, the color experience. The label blue corresponds to a region blue in the color space, and then, so to say, in the ideal case, this is a yes or no. We can infer with probability 1 whether that object, whether it's blue or not, namely in dependence of whether the point how we perceive it is in that region or not. Of course, this assumes here that we rely completely on our sense data, so we don't make a difference between looking blue and being blue, and we also assume there's nothing going wrong with perception here. But in principle, you already see how this provides the fundament for rational reasoning from non-conceptual content to conceptual content, to beliefs. Of course, right, so if you think like borderline cases, I assumed here that kind of we can fully rely on perceptual experience, but still there are borderline cases, right? So like kind of, I don't know whether that's red or already orange, so I'm a little bit unsure what to say here. But this theory can account for this as well. So if we, and basically it's just, we can still directly infer beliefs about color from the content of perception, but just with kind of less certainty here. Right, so again, in our visual experience, object O is represented as having this, as being this point in the space, right? So having this shade of color. The label blue is associated with certain regions in the phenomenal similarity space. The idea is kind of, you don't know where to delimit the region of blue, right? So you don't know where to draw the exact border. It's basically an epistemic uncertainty in concept learning, where mom exactly draws the boundary between blue and lilac or something like this, or kind of red and orange. And if you have this, then you can easily adapt the approach that we had before, right? So the idea is, does this work? So this one, kind of the probability that some object is in a certain region or falls under a given concept, given that it's this point in space, so to say, depends on kind of, it's a yes or no affair when you know with certainty what region corresponds to the label blue, but you're not uncertain about what region corresponds to the label blue, right? So, and by weighing these probabilities, so this one is always 1 or 0, just independent whether this one is in that region or not, right? So whether this point in the space is in that region R or not. But this one can be more, you're more or less convinced about that this is the right region where to draw the boundaries. And from this you can, so to some extent you still rely completely on your sense data. We don't make a distinction between looking blue and being blue, but we can already account for borderline cases. And you also can see how this one can get less than 1 or 0 or more than 0. Just so less than 0, for example, less than 1, for example, just in virtue of giving some regions where this point in the space is not in, some probability. Okay, so now we have a more realistic fundament for rational reasoning from non-propositional low-level perceptual experience to the conceptual content of beliefs. Good. There are certain advantages of this approach. So one is that the theory can already account for borderline cases and how we reason for this. It also can already explain degrees of belief, right? So justification to some degree of belief without assuming that perceptual experiences are degreed, right? So to some extent, you have kind of a very specific perceptual experience, a point in space, but you only come to a degreed perceptual beliefs about whether this is red or orange or not, without kind of putting the degree in the belief. That's really nice. It also can account for certain epistemological problems that we kind of, so that's for the those who love the epistemological literature like I do, right? So like there's some assumption about holism. The idea, every perceptual belief that you can have, the connection between a perceptual experience and a belief can always be defeated. There's always some background information that you can get such that this perceptual experience doesn't justify this belief. And here we can easily account for this just by getting the information, oh, you're misusing the concept, blue, for example, or no, that's not a rectangle, kind of, right? So just by this information, you can always defeat a certain belief, kind of, because so this is also very nice about this. So I feel this is a very nice approach for understanding the relation, the justificatory relations from perceptual experiences to beliefs. And certain idealizations are still in there, but nevertheless, kind of, as already said, so I'm assuming, so we have to get rid of certain idealizations, right? We have to include unreliable sense data, so make the difference between looking blue and being blue. And also a second kind of unreliable sense data, namely looks orange under red light, right? So sometimes actually the content of perception is a little bit more complicated. You have various kinds of information, right? So how this object looks to you, but also how the lighting is, and nevertheless we come to beliefs. And in this case, for example, we very often would infer this object is yellow, right? So it looks orange, is under red light, probably it's yellow. Good. But now I want to go back to this kind of to cognitive penetration, right? So how can beliefs influence the content of perceptual experience, right? So I argue to understand cognitive penetration, we have to return to Volition's central idea of cognitive penetration, that we need semantic relations between beliefs and perceptual experience. McPherson, however, argued, right? So yeah. So in principle, we already. I'm good. I believe. Right? I even can slow down. Yeah. So in principle, we already know how this could work now, right? So we have semantic relationships. I could end here. There are small minor problems. So McPherson also argued just semantic relationship is not enough, right? So suppose I believe that aliens are attacking Earth. This belief again induces a migraine. However, when X has a migraine, her experiences of flashing lights. Whenever X has a migraine, he experiences flashing lights in the top half of his visual field. The content of this experience therefore bears some semantic relationship to the belief, right? Suppose we want to understand this like this. But one might still want to deny that this is a case of cognitive penetration, right? So the idea is there's a semantic relationship between aliens attacking Earth and UFOs kind of in the sky, and now it looks like UFOs in the sky, so there's some semantic relationship, arguably, but it's nevertheless kind of the causal direction, kind of there seems to be kind of the wrong kind of causal relationship, right? Someone might want to claim that in addition to a semantic relation between the content of cognitive state and the perception, the intermediate state that does the penetrating in the example just given, the migraine state, has to have the content that it does because the cognitive state that causes it has the content that it has. Right, so, and here we then could borrow from kind of more recent approaches from David Lewis in causation, right, understanding cognitive penetration as causal influence, right, so a perceptual experience, E, is cognitively penetrated if and only if E is semantically and computationally dependent on that cognitive state C, and in virtue of the semantic or justificatory relations between the perceptual experience and the cognitive state or the belief, the connection between E and C varies with the content of the belief, right? So the idea is you only have, it's only a case of cognitive penetration if you could vary the content of the belief a little bit, and this would lead to analog variations in the content of perceptual experience. But in the migraine case, so to say, the idea is only if it's shockingly enough, then there's a migraine, and then you see these kind of flashing lights in the sky. So even, I don't know, attacks by airplanes could lead to the same perceptual experience, but this is not the case of cognitive penetration. And by using this definition of kind of, right, so variations in the content of belief lead to equal variations in the content of perceptual experience, right? So we now can understand cognitive penetration in a better way. And this idea then takes both ideas into consideration, so collisions, meaning that cognitive penetration requires semantic or justificatory relations, but also that semantic relations do not suffice, right? So it has to be the right kind of semantic relationship, namely in the sense of these variations. Good. And now I say thank you.